Section 23 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April Walters. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 6, 1866 to 1873, by Hans Christian Andersen, translated by H.P. PAULL. The Great Sea-Serpent. There was a little fish, a saltwater fish, of good family. I don't recall the name. You will have to get that from the learned people. This little fish had 1,800 brothers and sisters, all just as old as he. They did not know their father and mother, and were obliged to look out for themselves at the very beginning, and swim round. But that was great sport. They had water enough to drink, the entire ocean. They thought nothing about their food. It came when they wanted it. Each did as it pleased. Each was to make out its own story. Rather none of them thought at all about that. The sun shone down on the water that was light about them, so clear was it. It was a world with the strangest creatures, and some very horrid and big, with great gaping mouths that could gulp down all the 1,800 brothers and sisters. But neither did they think of that, for none of them as yet had been swallowed. The small ones swam side by side close together, as herrings and mackerel swim. But as they were swimming, their prettiest in the water and thinking of nothing, there sank with a prodigious noise from above, right down through them, a long, heavy thing that looked as if it would never come to an end. It stretched out farther and farther, and every one of the little fishes that scampered off was either crushed or got a crack that it could not stand. All the little fishes, and the great ones with them, from the level of the sea to the bottom, were thrown into a panic. The great horrid thing sank deeper and deeper, and grew longer and longer, miles and miles long. The fishes and snails, everything that swims or creeps or is driven by the current, saw this fearful thing, this enormous, incomprehensible sea eel, which had come down upon them in this fashion. What was the thing anyway? We know. It was the great interminable telegraph cable that people were laying between Europe and America. There was a confusion and commotion amongst all the rightful occupants of the sea where the cable was laid. The flying fishes shot up above the surface as high as they could fling themselves. The blowfish took a leap an entire gunshot in length over the water, for it can do that. The other fish made for the bottom of the sea, and went down with such haste that they reached it long before the telegraph was seen or known about down there. They poured in on the cod and flounders that lived peaceably at the bottom of the sea and ate their neighbors. One or two of the sea anemones were so agitated that they threw up their stomachs, but they lived on after it just the same, for they can do that. A good many lobsters and crabs got out of their excellent shells and were obliged to wait for their bones to grow back again. In all this fright and confusion, the 1,800 brethren and sisters became separated, and never again met or even knew each other after that. Only some 10 of them remained still in the same place, and so in a few hours they got over the first fright and began to be curious about the affair. They looked about them, they looked up, and they looked down, and down in the depths they fancied they saw the fearful thing that had scared them. Yes, had scared all, great and small, lying on the bottom of the sea, as far as their eyes could reach. It was quite thin, but they did not know how thick it might be able to make itself, or how strong it was. It lay very quiet, but then that might be part of its cunning, they thought. "Let it lie, it does not come near us," said the most cautious of the little fishes. But the smallest one of all would not give up trying to find out what the thing could be. It had come down from above, so it was up above that one could best find out about it. So they swam up to the surface. It was perfectly still. They met a dolphin there. The dolphin is a sprightly fellow that can turn somersaults on the water, and it has eyes to see with, so it must have seen this and known all about it. They asked him, but he had only been thinking about himself and his somersaults. He had seen nothing, had no answer for them, and only looked high and mighty. Then they turned to the seal, which was just plunging in. It was more civil, for all that it eats small fish, but today it had had enough. It knew a little more than the dolphin. "Many a night have I lain upon a whetstone and looked far into the country. Miles away from here there are crafty creatures called in their speech men-folk. They plot against us, but usually we slip away from them. That I know well, and the sea eel too, that you're asking about, he knows it. He has been under their sway up there on the earth time out of mind, and it was from there that they were carrying him off on a ship to a distant land. I saw what a trouble they had, shut they could manage him, because he had become weak on the earth. They laid him in coils and circles. I heard how he wringled and wrangled when they laid him down and when he slipped away from them out there. They held on to him with all their might. Ever so many hands had hold of him, but he kept slipping away from them down to the bottom. There he is lying now, till further notice, I rather think. He is quite thin, said the small fishes. They have starved him, said the seal, but he'll soon come to himself and get his old size and corpulence again. I suppose he is the great sea-serpent that men are so afraid of and talk so much about. I never saw him before, and never believed in a sea-serpent. Now I do. I believe he is the sea-serpent. And with that, down went the seal. How much he knew! How he talked! Said the small fishes. I never was so wise before. If it only isn't all an untruth. We can, anyway, swim down and see for ourselves, said the littlest fish. On the way, we can hear what the others think about it. I wouldn't make a stroke with my fins to get at something to know, said the others, and turned away. But I would, said the littlest fellow, and put off down into deep water. But it was a good distance from the place where the long thing that sank lay. The little fish looked and hunted on all sides down in the deep water. Never before had it imagined the world to be so big. The herrings went in great shoals, shining like a mighty ribbon of silver. The mackerel followed after and looked even finer. There were fishes there of all fashions and marked with every possible color. Jellyfish, like half-transparent flowers, borne along by the currents. Great plants grew up from the floor of the ocean, grass fathoms long, and palm-like trees, every leaf tenanted by shining shellfish. At last the little fish spied a long dark streak away down, and made his way toward it, but it was neither fish nor cable. It was the gunwale of a sunken vessel, which above and below the deck was broken in two by the force of the sea. The little fish swam into the cabin, where the people who perished when the vessel sank were all washed away, except two. A young woman lay there stretched out, with her little child in her arms. They seemed to be sleeping. The little fish was quite frightened, for it did not know that they could never again waken. Seaweed hung like a network of foliage over the gunwale above the two beautiful bodies of mother and babe. It was so quiet, so solitary. The little fish scampered away as fast as it could, out where the water was bright and clear, and there were fishes to see. It had not gone far before it met a whale, fearfully big. "Don't swallow me!" cried the little fish. "I am not even to be tasted. I am so small, and it's a great comfort for me to live."
"What are you doing away down here, where your kind never come?"
asked the whale. So then the little fish told about the astonishingly long eel, or whatever the thing was, that had sunk down from above, and produced such a panic amongst all the other creatures in the sea.
"Ho, ho!"
said the whale, and he drew in such a rush of water he was ready to make a prodigious spout when he came to the surface for a breath.
"Ho, ho! So that was the thing that tickled me on the back when I was turning round. I thought it was a ship's mast that I could break up into clothespins. But it was not here that it was. No, a good deal farther out lies the thing. I'll go with you and look for it, for I have nothing else to do."
And so it swam off, and the little fish behind it, not too near, because there was a tearing stream, as it were, in the wake of the whale. They met a shark and an old sawfish. They too had heard of the famous sea eel, so long and so thin. They had not seen it, but now they would. "I'll go with you," said the shark, who was on the same road. "If the great sea-serpent is no thicker than a cable, then I can bite through it in one bite." And he opened his mouth and showed his 6 rows of teeth. "I can bite dents in a ship's anchor, and certainly can bite off the shank."
"There it is," said the great whale. "I see him."
He thought he saw better than the others.
"See how it rises, how it bends and bows and curves."
But it was not a sea-serpent, but an extraordinarily great eel, ever so many ells long, that grew near. "Why, I've seen him before," said the sawfish. "He has never made a hullabaloo in the sea or frightened any big fish out of his wits." And so they talked to him of the new eel, and asked if he would go with them on their voyage of discovery. "If that eel is longer than I am," said the sea eel, "there will be something disagreeable happening." "Aye, that there will," said the others, "but there are enough of us not to tolerate him." And so they shot ahead. But then there came right in their way a great monster, bigger than all of them put together. It looked like a floating island that could not stop itself. It was a venerable whale. Its head was grown over with seaweed, its back covered with barnacles, and such innumerable oysters and mussels that its black skin was altogether whitened. "Come with us, old fellow," said they. "Here's a new fish come, and we won't stand it."
"I would rather lie where I am lying," said the whale. "Leave me alone, leave me alone. Oh, I suffer from the dreadful disease. My only relief is to get up toward the surface and get my back up higher. Then the great sea fowl can come and pick at me. That feels so good, only when they do not drive their beaks in too far. Sometimes they go in too deep, quite into my blubber. You can see now how a complete skeleton of a fowl is fixed on my back. She struck her claws in too deep, and could not get them out when I went down to the bottom. And now the little fishes have picked at her. See how she looks, and how I look. I am all diseased."
"That is all imagination," said the shark. "I am never sick. No fish is ever sick."
"Pardon me," said the whale. "The eel suffers from headache, the carp has the smallpox, and we all have intestinal worms."
"Nonsense," said the shark, and refused to hear any further, and the others would also rather not. They had something else to attend to. At last they came to the place where the telegraph cable lay. It has a pretty long bed on the floor of the sea from Europe to America, over sandbanks and sea mud, rocky ground and weedy places, entire forests of coral. The currents down there, too, change. Whirlpools eddy and fishes swarm in greater masses than the countless flocks of birds that men see when birds of passage take their flight. There's a stir, a splashing there, a humming and rushing. The rushing still haunts a little the great empty conch shells when we hold them to our ears. "There lies the fellow!" cried all the great fishes, and the little one with them. They saw the cable, the beginning and end of which vanished beyond the reach of their eyes. Sponges and polyps swayed from the ground, rose and fell over it so that now it was hidden, now came to view. Sea porcupines, snails, and worms moved over it. Gigantic crabs that had a complete fringe of creeping things stalked about it. Dark sea anemones, or whatever the creature is called that eats with its entire body, lay beside it and smelled of the new creature that had stretched itself on the bottom of the sea. Flounders and codfish turned over in the water so as to get an idea about it from all sides. The starfish, that always bores down into the mud and can keep its eyes outside, lay and stared to see what was to come of all this bustle. The telegraph cable lay without stirring, but life and thought were in it. Human thought went through it.
"The thing is crafty," said the whale. "It is able to strike me in the stomach, and that is my weak point."
"Let us grope along," said the polyps. "I have long arms and limber fingers. I have been moving by the side of it. Now I'll go a little faster." And so it stretched its most flexible, longest arms down the cable and around it. "It has no scales," said the polyps. "It has no skin at all. I do believe it never feeds its own young." The sea eel laid itself by the side of the telegraph cable and stretched out as far as it could. "The thing is longer than I am," it said, "but it's not length that does anything. One must have skin, stomach, and flexibility." The whale dove down deeper than it had ever been. "Art thou fish, or art thou plant?" it asked. "Or art thou only some piece of work made up above that cannot thrive down here amongst us?" The telegraph cable did not answer. It has no power for that. Yet thoughts go through it, men's thoughts, that rush in 1 second miles upon miles from land to land. "Will you answer, or will you take a crack?" asked the fierce shark, and all the other great fishes asked the same thing. The cable did not stir, but it had its private thought, and such a one it had a right to have when it was full of thoughts. "Let them only give me a crack, then I shall be hauled up and be myself again. That has happened to others of my race in shallower waters." So it gave no answer. It had something else to attend to. It telegraphed and lay in its lawful place at the bottom of the ocean. Up above, the sun now went down, as men say. It became like flaming fire, and all the clouds glowed with fiery color, each more splendid than the other. "Now we shall get the red light," said the polyps, "and can see the thing better if need be." "At it," shouted the shark. "At it," said the swordfish and the whale and the eel. They rushed forward, the shark foremost, but just as it was about to grip the wire, the swordfish, out of pure politeness, ran his saw right into the back of the shark. It was a great mistake, and the shark lost all its strength for biting. There was a hubbub down in the mud. Great fishes and small sea anemones and snails rushed at one another, ate each other, mashed, and squeezed in. The cable lay quietly and attended to its affairs, and that one ought to do. The dark night brooded over them, but the ocean's millions upon millions of living creatures lighted it. Crawfish, not so big as a pinhead, gave out light. Some were so small that it took 1,000 to make one pinhead, yet they gave light. It certainly is wonderful, but that's the way it is. These sea creatures looked at the telegraph wire. "What is that thing?" they asked, "and what isn't it?" That was the question. Then there came an old sea cow. Folks on the earth call its kind a mermaid, or else a merman. This was a she, had a tail and 2 short arms to splash with, hanging breasts, and seaweed and sponges on her head, and that was what she was proud of. "Will you have the society of intelligent people?" said she. "I am the only one down here that can give it, but I ask in return for a perfectly secure pasturage on the bottom of the sea for me and mine. I am a fish, as you see, and I am also an amphibious animal. With practice, I am the wisest cow in the sea. I know about everything that goes on down here, and all that goes on above. The thing that you are pondering over is from above, and whatever plumps down from up there is either dead or comes to be dead and powerless. Let it lie there for what it is. It's only some invention of man." "Now I think there is something more to it," said the little fish. "Hold your tongue, mackerel," said the great sea cow. "Stickleback," said the rest, and that was even more insulting. And the sea cow explained to them that this terrible thing, which to be sure had not given out a single mutter, was only some invention from the dry land. And it delivered a little oration on the rottenness of men. "They want to get a hold of us," said she. "That's all they live for. They stretch nets for us and come with bait on a hook to catch us. That stupid thing there is some kind of big string, which they think we are going to bite at. They are such stupids. We are not. Only do not touch it, and it will shrivel up and all turn to dust and mud. Everything that comes down from up there is full of cracks and breaks and is good for nothing." "Good for nothing," said all the creatures in the sea, and held fast to the sea cow's opinion, so as to have an opinion. The little fish had its own thoughts. "That exceedingly long, thin serpent is perhaps the most wonderful fish in the ocean. I have a feeling it is." "The very most wonderful," say we human folks, and say it with knowledge and assurance. "It is the Great Sea-Serpent, long ago the theme of song and story. It was born and nourished and sprang forth from men's cunning, and was laid upon the bottom of the sea, stretching from the eastern to the western land, bearing messages quick as light flashes to our earth. It grows in might and in length, grows year by year through all seas, round the world, beneath the stormy waves and the lucid waters, where the skipper looks down as if he sailed through transparent air, and sees a swimming fish, brilliant fireworks of color. Down, far down, stretches the serpent, Midgard's snake, that bites its own tail as it encircles the earth. Fish and shell beat upon it with their heads. They understand not the thing. It is from above. Men's thoughts in all language course through it noiselessly. The serpent of science for good and evil, Midgard's snake, the most wonderful of all the ocean's wonders, our Great Sea-Serpent. End of The Great Sea-Serpent, Section 23. Recording by April Walters.
Section 24 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brad Philippone. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairy Tales and Short Stories, Volume 6, 1866 to 1873, by Hans Christian Andersen, translated by H.P. PAULL. Chapter 24. The Gardener and the Manor, by Hans Christian Andersen. About 1 Danish mile from the capital stood an old manor house with thick walls, towers, and pointed gable ends. Here lived, but only in the summer season, a rich and courtly family. The manor house was the best and the most beautiful of all the houses they owned. It looked outside as if it had just been cast in a foundry, and within it was comfort itself. The family arms were carved in stone over the door. Beautiful roses twined about the arms and the balcony. A grass plot extended before the house with red thorn and white thorn, and many rare flowers grew even outside the conservatory. The manor kept also a very skilful gardener. It was a real pleasure to see the flower garden, the orchard, and the kitchen garden. There was still to be seen a portion of the Manor's original garden, a few box-tree hedges cut in shape of crowns and pyramids, and behind these 2 mighty old trees almost always without leaves. One might almost think that a storm or waterspout had scattered great lumps of manure on their branches, but each lump was a bird's nest. A swarm of rooks and crows from time immemorial had built their nests there. It was a town full of birds, and the birds were the manorial lords here. They did not care for the proprietors, the Manor's oldest family branch, nor for the present owner of the Manor. These were nothing to them, but they bore the wandering creatures below them, notwithstanding that once in a while they shot with guns in a way that made the birds' backbone shiver, and made every bird fly up, crying, "Rock, rock!" The gardener very often explained to the master the necessity of felling the old trees, as they did not look well, and by taking them away they would probably get rid of the screaming birds which would seek another place. But he never could be induced either to give up the trees or the swarm of birds. The Manor could not spare them, as they were relics of the good old times that ought to be kept in remembrance. "The trees are the birds' heritage by this time," said the master, "so let them keep them, my good Larsen." Larsen was the gardener's name, but that is of very little consequence in this story. "Haven't you room enough to work in, little Larsen? Have you not the flower garden, the greenhouses, the orchard, and the kitchen garden?" He cared for them. He kept them in order and cultivated them with zeal and ability, and the family knew it, but they did not conceal from him that they often tasted fruits and saw flowers in other houses that surpassed what he had in his garden, and that was a sore trial for the gardener, who always wished to do the best, and really did the best he could. He was a good-hearted and faithful servant. The owner sent one day for him, and told him kindly that the day before, at a party given by some friends of rank, they had eaten apples and pears which were so juicy and well flavoured that all the guests had loudly expressed their admiration. To be sure, they were not native fruits, but they ought by all means to be introduced here, and to be acclimatized if possible. They learned that the fruit was bought of one of the first fruit dealers in the city, and the gardener was to ride to town and find out about where they came from, and then order some slips for grafting. The gardener was very well acquainted with the dealer, because he was the very person to whom he sold the fruit that grew in the manor garden beyond what was needed by the family. So the gardener went to town and asked the fruit dealer where he had found those apples and pears that were praised so highly. "They are from your own garden," said the fruit dealer, and he showed him both the apples and pears, which he recognized. Now how happy the gardener felt! He hastened back to his master, and told him that the apples and pears were all from his own garden, but he would not believe it. "It cannot be possible, Larsen. Can you get a written certificate of that from the fruit dealer?" And he could, and brought him a written certificate. And now every day were set on the table great dishes filled with beautiful apples and pears from their own garden. Bushels and barrels of these fruits were sent to friends in the city and country, nay, were even sent abroad. It was exceedingly pleasant, but when they talked with the gardener, they said that the last 2 seasons had been remarkably favourable for fruits, and that fruits had done well all over the country. Some time passed. The family were at dinner at court. The next day the gardener was sent for. They had eaten melons at the royal table, which they found very juicy and well flavoured. They came from His Majesty's greenhouse. "You must go and see the court gardener, and let him give you some seeds of those melons." "But the gardener at the court got his melon seeds from us," said the gardener, highly delighted. "But then that man understands how to bring the fruit to a higher perfection," was the answer. "Each particular melon was delicious." "Well then, I really may feel proud," said the gardener. "I must tell your lordship that the gardener at the court did not succeed very well with his melons this year, and so, seeing how beautiful ours look, he tasted them and ordered from me 3 of them for the castle." "Larsen, do not pretend to say that those were melons from our garden." "Really, I dare say as much," said the gardener, who went to the court gardener and got from him a written certificate to the effect that the melons on the royal table were from the Manor. That was certainly a great surprise to the family, and they did not keep the story to themselves. Melon seeds were sent far and wide, in the same way as had been done with the slips, which they were now hearing had begun to take, and to bear fruit of an excellent kind. The fruit was named after the Manor, and the name was written in English, German, and French. This was something they never had dreamed of. "We are afraid that the gardener will come to think too much of himself," said they. But he looked on it in another way. What he wished was to get the reputation of being one of the best gardeners in the country, and to produce every year something exquisite out of all sorts of garden stuff, and that he did. But he often had to hear that the fruits which he first bought, the apples and pears, were after all the best. All other kinds of fruit were inferior to these. The melons, too, were very good, but they belonged to quite another species. His strawberries were very excellent, but by no means better than many others, and when it happened one year that his radishes did not succeed, they only spoke of them, and not of other good things he had made succeed. It really seemed as if the family felt some relief in saying, "It won't turn out well this year, little Larsen." They seemed quite glad when they could say, "It won't turn out well." The gardener used always twice a week to bring them fresh flowers, tastefully arranged, and the colours by his arrangements were brought out in stronger light. "You have good taste, Larsen," said the owner, "but that is a gift from our Lord, not from yourself." One day the gardener brought a great crystal vase, with a floating leaf of white water-lily, upon which was laid, with its long thick stalk descending into the water, a sparkling blue flower as large as a sunflower. "The sacred lotos of Hindostan!" exclaimed the family. They had never seen such a flower. It was placed every day in the sunshine, and in the evening under artificial light. Every one who saw it found it wonderfully beautiful and rare, and that said the most noble young lady in the country, the wise and kind-hearted princess. The lord of the manor deemed it an honour to present her with the flower, and the princess took it with her to the castle. Now the master of the house went down to the garden to pluck another flower of the same sort, but he could not find any. So he sent for the gardener and asked him where he kept the blue lotus. "I have been looking for it in vain," said he. "I went into the conservatory, and round about the flower garden." "No, it is not there," said the gardener. "It is nothing else than a common flower from the kitchen garden. But do you not find it beautiful? It looks as if it was the blue cactus, and yet it is only a kitchen herb. It is the flower of the artichoke." "You should have told us that at the time," said the master. "We supposed, of course, that it was a strange and rare flower. You have made us ridiculous in the eyes of the young princess. She saw the flower in our house and thought it beautiful. She did not know the flower, and she is versed in botany too. But then that has nothing to do with kitchen herbs. How could you take it into your head, my good Larsen, to put such a flower up in our drawing-room? It makes us ridiculous." And the magnificent blue flower from the kitchen garden was turned out of the drawing-room, which was not at all the place for it. The master made his apology to the princess, telling her that it was only a kitchen herb which the gardener had taken into his head to exhibit, but that he had been well reprimanded for it. "That was a pity," said the princess, "for he has really opened our eyes to see the beauty of a flower in a place where we should not have thought of looking for it. Our gardener shall every day, as long as the artichoke is in bloom, bring one of them up into the drawing-room." Then the master told his gardener that he might again bring a fresh artichoke flower. "It is, after all, a very nice flower," said he, "and a truly remarkable one." And so the gardener was praised again. "Larsen likes that," said the master. "He is a spoiled child." In the autumn there came up a great gale, which increased so violently in the night, that several large trees in the outskirts of the wood were torn up by the roots, and to the great grief of the household, but to the gardener's delight, the two big trees blew down, with all their birds' nests on them. In the manor house they heard during the storm the screaming of rooks and crows beating their wings against the windows. "Now I suppose you are happy, Larsen," said the master. "The storm has felled the trees, and the birds have gone off to the woods. There is nothing left from the good old days. It is all gone, and we are very sorry for it." The gardener said nothing, but he thought of what he long had turned over in his mind. How could he make that pretty sunny spot very useful, so that it could become an ornament to the garden and a pride to the family? The great trees which had been blown down had shattered the venerable hedge of box that was cut into fanciful shapes. Here he set out a multitude of plants that were not to be seen in other gardens. He made an earthen wall, on which he planted all sorts of native flowers from the fields and woods. What no other gardener had ever thought of planting in the manor garden, he planted, giving each its appropriate soil, and the plants were in sunlight or shadow according as each species required. He cared tenderly for them, and they grew up finely. The juniper tree from the heaths of Jutland rose in shape and colour like the Italian cypress. The shining, thorny Christthorn, as green in the winter's cold as in the summer's sun, was splendid to see. In the foreground grew ferns of various species. Some of them looked as if they were children of the palm tree, others as if they were parents of the pretty plants called Venus's golden locks or maiden's hair. Here stood the despised burdock, which is so beautiful in its freshness that it looks well even in a bouquet. The burdock stood in a dry place, but below in the moist soil grew the coltsfoot, also a despised plant, but yet most picturesque with its tall stem and large leaf. Like a candelabrum with a multitude of branches 6 feet high, and with flower over against flower, rose the mullein, a mere field plant. Here stood the woodroof, and the lily of the valley, the wild calla, and the fine 3-leaved wood sorrel. It was a wonder to see all this beauty. In the front grew in rows very small pear trees from French soil, trained on wires. By plenty of sun and good care they soon bore as juicy fruits as in their own country. Instead of the 2 old leafless trees was placed a tall flagstaff, where the flag of Dannebrog was displayed, and near by stood another pole, with the hob tendril in summer or harvest time wound its fragrant flowers, but in winter time, after ancient custom, oaked sheaves were fastened to it, that the birds of the air might find here a good meal in the happy Christmas time. "Our good Larsen is growing sentimental as he grows old," said the family, "but he is faithful and quite attached to us." In one of the illustrated papers there was a picture at New Year's of the old manor, with the flagstaff and the oat sheaves for the birds of the air, and the paper said that the old manor had preserved that beautiful old custom, and deserved great credit for it. "They beat the drum for all Larsen's doing," said the family. "He is a lucky fellow, and we may almost be proud of having such a man at our service." But they were not a bit proud of it. They were very well aware that they were the lords of the manor. They could give Larsen warning, in fact, but they did not. They were good people, and fortunate it is for every Mr. Larsen that there are so many good people like them. Yes, that is the story of the gardener and the manor. Now you may think a little about it. End of chapter 24. The Gardener and the Manor.
The Cripple by Hans Christian Andersen, 1872. There was an old country house which belonged to young, wealthy people. They had riches and blessings, they liked to enjoy themselves, but they did good as well. They wished to make everybody as happy as they were themselves. On Christmas Eve, a beautifully decorated Christmas tree stood in the old hall, where the fire burned in the chimney, and fir branches were hung round the old pictures. Here were assembled the family and their guests, and there was dancing and singing. Earlier in the evening there had been a Christmas gaiety in the servants' hall. Here also was a great fir tree with red and white candles, small Danish flags, swans and fishing nets cut out of colored paper and filled with goodies. The poor children from the neighborhood were invited. Everyone had his mother with him. The mothers did not look much at the Christmas tree, but at the Christmas table, where there lay linen and woolen cloth, stuff for gowns and stuff for trousers. They and the bigger children looked there, only the very little ones stretched out their hands to the candles and the tinsel and flags. The whole party came early in the afternoon and got Christmas porridge and roast goose with red cabbage. Then, when the Christmas tree was seen and the gifts distributed, each got a little glass of punch with apple fritters. Then they went back to their own poor homes and talked of the good living, that is to say good things to eat, and the gifts were once more inspected. There were now Garden Kristingj and Garden Ollie. They were married, and they had their house and daily bread for weeding and digging in the garden of the big house. Every Christmas festival, they got a good share of the gifts. They had 5 children, and all of them were clothed by the family. They are generous people, our master and mistress, said they, but they have the means to be so, and they have pleasure in doing it. Here are good clothes for the 4 children to wear, said Ollie, but why is there nothing for the cripple? They used to think about him too, although he was not at the festival. It was the eldest of the children they called the cripple. He was called Hans otherwise. As a little boy, he was the smartest and liveliest child, but he became all at once loose in the legs, as they call it. He could neither walk nor stand, and now he had been lying in bed for 5 years. Yes, I've got something for him too, said Mother, but it is nothing much. It is only a book to read. He won't get fat on that, said the father. But Hans was glad of it. He was a very clever boy who liked to read, but used his time also for working, so far as one who must always lie in bed could be useful. He was very handy, and knitted woolen stockings and even bed covers. The lady at the big house had praised and bought them. It was a storybook Hans had got. In it there was much to read and much to think about. It is not of any kind of use here in the house, said his parents, but let him read. It passes the time. He cannot always be knitting stockings. The spring came, flowers and green leaves began to sprout, the weeds also, as one may call the nettles, although the psalm speaks so nicely of them. Though kings in all their power and might came forth in splendid row, they could not make the smallest leaf upon a nettle grow. There was much to do in the garden, not only for the gardener and his apprentice, but also for Kristingj and Ollie. It is perfect drudgery, they said. We have no sooner raked the paths and made them nice than they are just trodden down again. There is such a run of visitors up at the house. How much it must cost! But the family are rich people. Things are badly divided, said Ollie. The priest says we are all our father's children. Why the difference then? It comes from the fall, said Kristingj. They talked about it again in the evening where Cripple Hans lay with his storybook. Straitened circumstances, work and drudgery had made the parents not only hard in the hands, but also in their opinions and judgments. They could not grasp it, could not explain it, and made themselves more peevish and angry as they talked. Some people get prosperity and happiness, others only poverty. Why should our first parents' disobedience and curiosity be visited upon us? We would not have behaved ourselves as they did. Yes, we would, said Cripple Hans all at once. It's all here in the book. What is in the book? Asked the parents. And Hans read for them the old story of the woodcutter and his wife. They also scolded about Adam and Eve's curiosity, which was the cause of their misfortune. The king of the country came past just then. Come home with me, he said, then you shall have it as good as I. 7 courses for dinner and a course for show. That is in a closed tureen, and you must not touch it, for if you do, it is all over with your grandeur. What can there be in the tureen? Said the wife. That does not concern us, said the man. Yes, I am not inquisitive, said the wife, but I would only like to know why we dare not lift the lid. It is certainly something delicate. If only it is not something mechanical, said the man, such as a pistol which goes off and wakens the whole house. Oh my, said the wife, and did not touch the tureen. But during the night she dreamt that the lid lifted itself, and from the tureen came a smell of the loveliest punch, such as one gets at weddings and funerals. There lay a big silver shilling with the inscription, "Drink of this punch, and you will become the 2 richest people in the world, and everybody else will become beggars." And the wife wakened at once and told her husband her dream. You think too much about the thing, he said. We could lift it gently, said the wife. "Gently," said the man, and the wife then lifted the lid very gently. Then two little active mice sprang out and ran at once into a mouse hole. "Good night," said the king. "Now you can go home and lie in your own bed. Don't scold Adam and Eve any more. You yourselves have been as inquisitive and ungrateful." "From where has that story come in the books?" said Ole. "It looks as if it concerned us. It is something to think about." Next day they went to work again. They were roasted by the sun and soaked to the skin with rain. In them were fretful thoughts, and they ruminated on them. It was still quite light at home after they had eaten their milk porridge. "Read the story of the woodcutter to us again," said Ole. "There are so many nice ones in the book," said Hans. "So many, you don't know." "Yes, but I don't care about them," said Ole. "I want to hear the one I know." And he and his wife listened to it again. More than one evening they returned to the story. "It cannot quite make everything clear to me," said Ole. "It is with people as with sweet milk, which sours. Some become fine cheese, and others the thin, watery whey. Some people have luck in everything, sit at the high table every day, and know neither sorrow nor want." Cripple Hans heard that. He was weak in the legs, but clever in the head. He read to them from his storybook, read about the man without sorrow or want. Where was he to be found? For found he must be. The king lay sick and could not be cured, except by being dressed in the shirt which had been worn on the body of a man who could truthfully say that he had never known sorrow or want. Messages were sent to all the countries in the world, to all castles and estates, to all prosperous and happy men. But when it was properly investigated, every one of them had experienced sorrow and want. "That I have not," said the swineherd, who sat in the ditch and laughed and sang, "I am the happiest man." "Then give us your shirt," said the king's messengers. "You shall be paid for it with half of the kingdom." But he had no shirt, and yet he called himself the happiest man. "That was a fine fellow," shouted Ole, and he and his wife laughed as they had not laughed for a year and a day. Then the schoolmaster came past. "How you are enjoying yourselves," said he. "That is something new in this house. Have you won a prize in the lottery?" "No, we are not of that kind," said Ole. "It is Hans who has been reading his storybook to us about the man without sorrow or want, and the fellow had no shirt. One's eyes get moist when one hears such things, and from that printed book. Every one has his load to draw. One is not alone in that. That is always a comfort." "Where did you get that book?" asked the schoolmaster. "Our Hans got it more than a year ago at Christmas time. The master and his mistress gave it to him. They know that he likes reading so much, and he is a cripple. We would rather have seen him get 2 linen shirts at the time, but the book is wonderful. It can almost answer one's thoughts." The schoolmaster took the book and opened it. "Let's have the same story again," said Ole. "I have not quite taken it in yet. Then you must also read the other one about the woodcutter." These 2 stories were enough for Ole. They were like 2 sunbeams coming into the poor room, into the stunted thought which made him so cross and ill-natured. Hans had read the whole book, read it many times. The stories carried him out into the world, there where he could not go because his legs would not carry him. The schoolmaster sat by his bed. They talked together, and it was a pleasure for both of them. From that day the schoolmaster came oftener to Hans, when the parents were at work. It was a treat for the boy every time he came. How he listened to what the old man told him about the size of the world and its many countries, and that the sun was almost 500,000 times bigger than the earth, and so far away that a cannonball in its course would take a whole 25 years to come from the sun to the earth, whilst the beams of light could come in 8 minutes. Every industrious schoolboy knew all that, but for Hans it was all new, and still more wonderful than what was in the storybook. The schoolmaster dined with the squire's family 2 or 3 times a year, and he told how much importance the storybook had in the poorhouse, where 2 stories in it alone had been the means of spiritual awakening and blessing. The weakly, clever little boy had his reading brought reflections and joy into the house. The weakly, clever little boy had, with his reading, brought reflections and joy into the house. When the schoolmaster went away, the lady pressed 2 or 3 silver dollars into his hand for little Hans. Father and mother must have them, said Hans when the schoolmaster brought the money. And Ole and Kristingj said, Cripple Hans, after all, is a prophet and a blessing. 2 or 3 days after, when the parents were at work at the big house, the squire's carriage stopped outside. It was the kind-hearted lady who came, glad that her Christmas present had been such a comfort and pleasure for the boy and his parents. She brought with her fine bread, fruit, and a bottle of fruit syrup, but was still more delightful, she brought him in a gilt cage a little blackbird, which could whistle quite charmingly. The cage with the bird was set up on the old clothes chest, a little bit away from the boy's bed. He could see the bird and hear it, even if the people out in the road could hear its song. Ole and Kristingj came home after the lady had driven away. They noticed how glad Hans was, but thought there would be only trouble with the present he had got. Rich people don't have much foresight, said they. Shall we now have that to look after also? Cripple Hans cannot do it. The end will be that the cat will take it. 8 days passed, and still another 8 days. The cat had, in that time, been often in the room, without frightening the bird, to say nothing of hurting it. Then a great event happened. It was afternoon. The parents and the other children were at work. Hans was quite alone. He had the storybook in his hand, and read about the fisherwoman who got everything she wished for. She wished to be a king, and that she became. She wished to be an emperor, and that she became. But when she wished to become the good God, then she sat once more in the muddy ditch she had come from. The story had nothing to do with the bird or the cat, but it was just the story he was reading when the incident happened. He always remembered that afterwards. The cage stood on the chest. The cat stood on the floor and stared at the bird with his greeny gold eyes. There was something in the cat's face which seemed to say, "How lovely you are! How I should like to eat you!" Hans could understand that. He read it in the cat's face. "Be off, cat," he shouted. "Will you go out of the room?" It seemed as if it were just about to spring. Hans could not get at him, and he had nothing else to throw at him but his dearest treasure, the storybook. He threw that, but the binding was loose, and it flew to one side, and the book itself, with all its leaves, flew to the other. The cat went with slow steps a little back into the room, and looked at Hans, as much as to say, "Don't mix yourself up in this affair, little Hans. I can walk, and I can spring, and you can do neither." Hans kept his eyes on the cat and was greatly distressed. The bird was also anxious. There was no one there to call. It seemed as if the cat knew it. It prepared itself again to spring. Hans shook the bed cover at him. His hands he could use, but the cat paid no attention to the bed cover, and when it was also thrown at him without avail, he sprang upon the chair and into the windowsill, where he was nearer to the bird. Hans could feel his own warm blood in himself, but he did not think of that. He thought only about the cat and the bird. The boy could not help himself out of bed, could not stand on his legs, still less walk. It seemed as if his heart turned inside him when he saw the cat spring from the window, right onto the chest, and push the cage so that it was upset. The bird fluttered wildly about inside. Hans gave a scream. Something gave a tug inside him, and without thinking about it, he jumped out of bed, flew across to the chest, tore the cat down, and got hold of the cage, where the bird was in a great fright. He held the cage in his hands and ran with it out of the door and out onto the road. Then the tears streamed out of his eyes. He shouted with joy, "I can walk! I can walk!" He had recovered his activity again. Such things can happen, and it had happened to him. The schoolmaster lived close by. Hans ran into him with his bare feet, with only his shirt and jacket on, and with the bird in the cage. "I can walk," he shouted, "my God," and he sobbed and wept with joy. And there was joy in the house of Ole and Kristingj. "A more joyful day we could not see," said both of them. Hans was called up to the big house. He had not gone that way for many years. It seemed as if the trees and the nut bushes, which he knew so well, nodded to him and said, "Good day, Hans. Welcome here." The sun shone on his face as well as in his heart. The master and mistress let him sit with them, and looked as glad as he had belonged to their own family. Gladdest of all was the lady who had given him the storybook, given him the singing bird, which was now, as a matter of fact, dead of fright, but had been the means of restoring him to health, and the book had brought the awakening of the parents. He had the book still. He would keep it and read it if he were ever so old. Now he could be a benefit to those at home. He would learn a trade, by preference a bookbinder, because he said, I can get all the new books to read. In the afternoon, the lady called both parents up to her. She and her husband had talked together about Hans. He was a wise and clever boy, had pleasure in reading and ability. That evening the parents came home joyfully from the farm. Kristin in particular, but the week after she wept, for then little Hans went away. He was dressed in good clothes. He was a good boy, but now he must go away across the salt water, far away to school, and many years would pass before they would see him again. He did not get the storybook with him. The parents kept that for remembrance, and the father often read in it, but nothing except the 2 stories, for he knew them. And they got letters from Hans, each one gladder than the last. He was with fine people, in good circumstances, and it was most delightful to go to school. There was so much to learn and to know. He only wanted to remain there 100 years and then be a schoolmaster. If we should live to see it, said the parents, and pressed each other's hands as if at communion. To think of what has happened to Hans, said Ole. Our father thinks also of the poor man's child, and that it should happen just with the cripple. Is it not as if Hans were to read it for us out of the storybook? End of The Cripple.
Section 26 of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristingj. Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 6, 1866 to 1873, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.B. PAULL. The Flea and the Professor. Published in Scribner's Monthly, Volume 5, Issue 6. April 1873. There was once an aeronaut with whom things went badly. The balloon burst, tumbled the man out, and broke into bits. His boy he had 2 minutes before sent down with a parachute. That was the boy's luck. He was unhurt, and went about with knowledge enough to make him an aeronaut too, but he had no balloon and no means of acquiring one. But live he must, and so he applied himself to the art of legerdemain, and to talking in his stomach. In fact, he became a ventriloquist, as they say. He was young, good-looking, and when he got a moustache and had his best clothes on, he could be taken for a nobleman's son. The ladies seemed to think well of him. One young lady even was so taken with his charms and his great dexterity that she went off with him to foreign parts. There he called himself Professor. He could scarcely do less. His constant thought was how to get himself a balloon, and go up in the air with his little wife, but as yet they had no means. "They'll come yet," said he. "If only they would," said she. "We are young folks," said he, "and now I am Professor." She helped him faithfully, sat at the door and sold ticket to the exhibition, and it was a chilly sort of pleasure in winter time. She also helped him in the line of his art. He put his wife in a table drawer, a large table drawer. Then she crawled into the back part of the drawer, and so was not in the front part, quite an optical illusion to the audience. But one evening when he drew the drawer out, she was also out of sight to him. She was not in the front drawer, not in the back one either, not in the house itself, nowhere to be seen or heard. That was her feat of legerdemain, her entertainment. She never came back again. She was tired of it all, and he grew tired of it, lost his good humour, could not laugh or make jokes. And so the people stopped coming, his earnings became scanty, his clothes gave out, and finally he only owned a great flea, which his wife had left him, and so he thought highly of it. And he dressed the flea, and taught it to perform, to present arms, and to fire a cannon off, but it was a little cannon. The Professor was proud of the Flea, and the Flea was proud of himself. He had learned something, and had human blood, and had been besides to the largest cities, had been seen by princes and princesses, had received their high praise, and it was printed in the newspaper and on placards. Plainly it was a very famous Flea, and could support a Professor and his entire family. The Flea was proud and famous, and yet when he and the Professor travelled, they took fourth-class carriages on the railway. They went just as quickly as the first class. They were betrothed to each other. It was a private engagement that would never come out. They never would marry. The Flea would remain a bachelor, and the Professor a widower. That made it balance. "Where one has the best luck," said the Professor, "there one ought to go twice." He was a good judge of character, and that is also a science of itself. At last he had travelled over all countries except the wild ones, and so he wanted to go there. They each Christian men there, to be sure, the Professor knew, but then he was not properly Christian, and the Flea was not properly a man, so he thought they might venture to travel there and have good success. They travelled by steamship and by sailing vessel. The Flea performed his tricks, and so they got a free passage on the way and arrived at the wild country. Here reigned a little princess. She was only 8 years old, but she was reigning. She had taken away the power from her father and mother, for she had a will, and then she was extraordinarily beautiful. And rude. Just as soon as the Flea had presented arms and fired off the cannon, she was so enraptured with him that she said, "Him or nobody!" She became quite wild with love, and was already wild in other ways. "Sweet little sensible child," said her own father, "if one could only first make a man of him." "Leave that to me, old man," said she, and that was not well said by a little princess when talking with her father, but she was wild. She set the Flea on her white hand. "Now you are a man, reigning with me, but you shall do what I want you to, or else I'll kill you and eat the Professor." The Professor had a great hall to live in. The walls were made of sugar cane, and he could lick them, but he was not a sweet tooth. He had a hammock to sleep in. It was as if he were lying in a balloon, such as he had always wished for himself. That was his constant thought. The Flea lived with the Princess, sat upon her delicate hand and upon her white neck. She had taken a hair from her head and made the Professor tie it to the Flea's leg, and so she kept him tied to the great red coral drop which she wore in her ear tip. What a delightful time the Princess had, and the Flea too, she thought, but the Professor was not very comfortable. He was a traveller, he liked to drive from town to town, and read about its perseverance and cleverness in teaching a Flea to do what men do. But he got out of and into his hammock, lounged about and had good feeding, fresh birds' eggs, elephants' eyes, and roast giraffe. People that eat men do not live entirely on cooked men. No, that is a great delicacy. "Shoulder of children with sharp sauce," said the Princess's mother, "is the most delicate." The Professor was tired of it all and would rather go away from the wild land, but he must have his Flea with him, for that was his prodigy, and his bread and butter. How was he to get hold of him? That was no easy matter. He strained all his wits, and then he said, "Now I have it. Princess's father, grant me a favour. May I summon your subjects to present themselves before your Royal Highness? That is what is called a ceremony in the high and mighty countries of the world." "Can I, too, learn to do that?" asked the Princess's father. "That is not quite proper," replied the Professor, "but I shall teach your wild fatherships to fire a cannon off. It goes off with a bang. One sits high up aloft, and then off it goes or down he comes." "Let me crack it off," said the Princess's father, but in all the land there was no cannon except the one the Flea had brought, and that was so very small. "I will cast a bigger one," said the Professor, "only give me the means. I must have fine silk stuff, needle and thread, rope and cord, together with cordial drops for the balloon. They blow one up so easily and give one the heaves. They are what make the report in the cannons inside." "By all means," said the Princess's father, and gave him what he called for. All the court and the entire population came together to see the great cannon cast. The Professor did not summon them before he had the balloon entirely ready to be filled and go up. The Flea sat on the Princess's hand and looked on. The balloon was filled, it bulged out and could scarcely be held down, so violent did it become. "I must have it up in the air before it can be cooled off," said the Professor, and took his seat in the car which hung below. "But I cannot manage and steer it alone. I must have a skilful companion along to help me. There is no one here that can do that except the Flea." "I am not very willing to let him," said the Princess, but still she reached out and handed the flea to the Professor, who placed him on his hand. "Let go of the cords and ropes," he shouted. "Now the balloon's going." They thought he said "the cannon," and so the balloon went higher and higher up above the clouds, far away from the wild land. The little Princess, all the family, and the people sat and waited. They are waiting still, and if you do not believe it, just take a journey to the wild land. Every child there talks about the Professor and the flea, and believes that they are coming back when the cannon is cooled off. But they will not come. They are at home with us. They are in their native country. They travel on the railway, first class, not fourth. They have good success, a great balloon. Nobody asks how they got a balloon, or where it came from. They are rich folks now, quite respectable folks indeed. The Flea and the Professor. End of The Flea and the Professor. End of Hans Christian Andersen, Fairytales and Short Stories, Volume 6, 1866 to 1873, by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.B. Paull.